Well, good morning, everyone. I am Tasha Green Cruzat, Executive Director for Voices for Illinois Children and Vice President of Public Policy for the YWCA Metropolitan Chicago. Welcome to the Voices for Illinois Children and United Voices for Children's webinar on Governor Pritzker's proposed state budget. Today's webinar will provide an overview of the budget proposal, the latest on the federal debate over a new stimulus package, and the outlook on the FY22 budget and the FY21 payments. So joining us today, we have Reverend Tim Beal, President of United Voices for Children, State Comptroller Susan Mendoza. She became comptroller in 2016, serving the last 2 years of Judy Barr Topinka's term. She was reelected in 2018, and prior to becoming the state comptroller, she was the Chicago city clerk and also served 6 terms in the Illinois House of Representatives. State Representative Tom Denner has served in the legislature since 2013. He is the House Republican point person on budget matters and serves on the House Appropriations Committee for Human Services. The chair of that committee is Representative Camille Lilly. She has served in the legislature since 2010. She is also the chief House sponsor of legislation on health and human services put forward by the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus. Congressman Brad Schneider was scheduled to join us today, but last-minute shifts in the House voting schedule caused him to have to cancel. Also joining us today is Deb Stein, the Network Director for the Partnership for America's Children, which is a network of 52 state and community child advocacy organizations in 41 states. I'm happy to be a proud board member and co-chair of that wonderful organization. We have extended an invitation to the governor's office, but no one was able to join. So at this time, I want to hand it over to Reverend Tim Beal to say a few words. I'm not sure if he's present, but I'm going to go ahead and put myself on mute and give it a second here. Okay, I don't think Reverend Tom Beal is with us at the moment. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Mitch Lipson, who is our Vice President of Policy for Voices for Illinois Children, to provide the overview of the FY 2022 budget.
Thank you for joining us. This will be a relatively high-level overview of the budget. We may or may not cover some of the line items that your organization is concerned about, but our intention here is to get a sense of the overall financial picture relative to the budget and the state's finances. The budget that was proposed for the governor is $41.6 billion. You can see here the breakout by general category. And what I want to point out in particular on this slide is that more than 20% of the expenditures are for pension costs. And then there's an additional sum of funds that are allocated for debt service on bonds that were used to put funds into the pension system. The comptroller can speak more to this in a little bit, but as of Friday, we had a backlog of more than $5 billion worth of bills. That did not include $4.3 billion in short-term borrowing that needs to be repaid. In essence, the governor's budget shows that when you take into account what we have in terms of outstanding debt, loans to be repaid, money that we borrowed from other state funds, and the backlog of bills, we are projected to end this fiscal year with outstanding liabilities of more than $7 billion. And as we can discuss further into this webinar, our total unfunded pension liability for all of the state systems stands at more than $140 billion. When the governor's office began putting together the budget for this fiscal year, they were initially looking at a $5.5 billion deficit. A couple of things happened. One is that turns out, looks like the economy is better than people had forecasted originally. People may not be going out to eat, but they're shopping more at the grocery store. They may not be going to the movie theater, but they're renting movies online. In addition, as many of you know, there's been really a bifurcation in terms of how this economy has progressed. Many of those at the lower income levels, particularly those in the leisure and hospitality industry, have lost their jobs. But at the same time, others have been working from home. And even for those who are collecting unemployment benefits, those benefits are taxable. So the forecast has been upped and is more rosier than was originally projected. Some of that borrowing from other state funds called for a repayment within 2 years. This budget calls for eliminating that deadline. There were additional modifications from the governor's office, according to them. They were able to achieve significant savings by renegotiating healthcare and insurance costs. And then through other management efforts, there were also savings that amounted to almost $1.3 billion. There is a diversion of certain revenue streams, or in some cases, we are not making the general transfers that we normally would. For example, there is a 10% reduction in what we would be transferring in income tax revenues to local governments, as well as to local transit districts. And then there is the proposed closure or elimination of certain tax expenditures, or depending on your point of view, you might call it a loophole. And we'll very briefly take a look at those items. Excuse me. For the next 3 years, the proposal calls for capping the loss that any corporation can take to 100,000. There were changes in the 2017 tax laws that made treatment of foreign sourced dividends more favorable than domestic dividends. This, for state tax purposes, would revert back to how domestic dividends are treated. There was an accelerated depreciation provision that was included for state tax purposes. This would essentially go back to the regular depreciation schedule. There's also a call to repeal certain items that were agreed to in 2019. This was repealing the elimination of the state's corporate franchise tax. There was a new tax that was instituted as an income tax credit for companies with regards to hiring of construction workers. And also what this does is that it would cap the amount of money that any retailer can take. A retailer is permitted to keep 1.75% of sales tax revenue for accounting for preparation costs and remitting that to the state. This would essentially cap the dollar amount for that. So all of that would be at $932 million. If these items did not materialize, there's that much of a shortfall in the budget. There's one other item to point out, which is that in January, the governor's office informed legislators that because of a new tax provision contained in one of the stimulus packages, which allowed companies to take additional losses from prior years, the state could lose $500 million or more if it does not decouple from that provision. So essentially, when you take out the pension cost, as far as the general operations of state government go, for education, public safety, human services, and other agencies, it is essentially flat. Some variations are within that. Couple of items that are within the budget to note: the early childhood block grant funding is level. This budget does not contain an additional $350 million for the evidence-based school funding formula. In 2017, when the state approved that new formula, the pledge and the target was to add an additional $350 million a year for the next 10 years. Last year, the state did not make that contribution, and the proposal here is that it would not be doing so. One of the justifications of the governor's office is that we are receiving $2.8 billion in federal funding as part of the stimulus packages, and that schools with the highest low-income populations will be the beneficiaries of much of this funding. Support for universities and community colleges is essentially level, although there is additional federal funding in the stimulus packages that goes directly to universities. And the monetary award program amount is increased, but it essentially allows the state to serve the same number of students. The Child Care Assistance Program will see an increase in funding. Early intervention programs see a decrease in funding. The rationale there from the state agency is that there is a reduction in the caseload. There are some advocates who have argued part of that reduction has come about because children are not in early childhood settings, and therefore potential developmental issues are not being recognized as frequently. Home visiting, essentially the funding is level. And again, I know that people are on this call who work in a variety of different areas. So just to note, there are some slight funding increases for mental health grants and also for addiction treatment. Department of Children and Family Services does see an increase of almost 8%. This is to take care of the increasing caseload and also to address issues where there are some deficiencies that were found in the last few years. And there was a need to reduce the caseloads per worker and also improve the interaction between different sections of the agency. But there is increased funding here for foster home programs, intact family services, and group homes. Medicaid. Essentially, the state is seeing an increase in the caseload because of the economic circumstances we're facing. However, because one of the federal stimulus packages increased the matching rate that the federal government provides to states for Medicaid services, the funding that is in the budget for Medicaid is essentially level. In fact, general funds is reduced by more than 600 million. There's an increase in some federal funding line items in that budget. And also to mention, under the Department of Human Services, there's a significant amount of money, most of it federal, from the relief packages for rental and mortgage assistance. Department of Human Services also, Department of Public Health also sees an infusion of funds to help with vaccinations and to help local health departments deal with providing those vaccinations and operating during the pandemic. What the governor's office and many members of the legislature are hoping for is additional federal assistance. And as we'll hear from some of our panelists in just a few minutes, the hope is that the $1.9 trillion package proposed by President Biden will have significant funding and relief for states. Just some of the provisions that are contained in there include new stimulus checks of $1,400, an extension of unemployment benefits with a $400 a week supplement, an expanded child tax credit and child care tax credit. There's also new money in this budget for K through 12, colleges and universities, child care, and increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour. In addition, there is more emergency rental and mortgage assistance. But what states are really hoping for are these two items that are in the middle of the page, which would provide relatively unrestricted funds to state governments and local governments. Illinois potentially could receive $7.5 billion. That is for state government itself. Municipalities would receive more. And given what we have outlined here, the question is, do we expand services that are not covered through other federal funds to assist Illinois residents? Do we pay down the backlog of bills? Do we repay the loans? Do we in fact close those corporate loopholes that we mentioned earlier? Those are all decisions that will now be before the General Assembly as it debates over the next few months what to do. The only wrinkle perhaps this year is that both chambers have now authorized meeting by committee remotely instead of in person due to the pandemic. So don't know if that will have any impact on how any of these activities occur, but the deadline still is the end of May to try and reach agreement on a budget. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I believe Vic may have joined us from Congressman Schneider's office. Hi, maybe you can just give us a quick sense of what the calendar does look like for this week and how this package looks like in the House.
Yeah, of course. First, my name is Vic Getz. I'm Congressman Schneider's senior policy advisor. I generally focus on health and some other aspects of his portfolio, including budget. I'm a stand-in for a stand-in, so I apologize. I've only had a short amount of time to prep, but I'm going to run you through kind of how this Congress has gone so far, what we're looking at this week, and that was a great summary of some of the provisions actually on your slides there that I think will be helpful. It's been a very busy start to the 117th Congress. I wish we could say that we only had to focus on the next COVID package, but we've also had to deal with January 6th attack on the Capitol, as well as impeachment proceedings in the Senate, which slowed things down. But we had all of our committee hearings or committee markups on reconciliation 2 weeks ago. This week, the Budget Committee is taking all of the individual portions of the reconciliation package that were passed out of their committee, that were passed out of committees. The Budget Committee is packaging them up as we speak, and then it goes to the House floor, hopefully on Friday evening. If not Friday evening, it'll be Saturday morning, at which point it will pass the House and be sent on to the Senate for their own consideration. Some of the top line pieces that we already touched on, but I'll just run back over. Under Ways and Means, which is Congressman Schneider's committee, were $1,400 relief checks, extending temporary unemployment benefits through August 29th, and increases the weekly benefit from $300 to $400. Under Education and Labor, there is $130 billion for elementary and secondary school emergency relief, $40 billion for higher education, and Illinois K through 12 it would get $5.3 billion. Illinois higher education would get $1.26 billion. Another $39 billion for childcare. Under that, Illinois would get $1.3 billion, and then another $1 billion for emergency relief for Head Start, of which Illinois would get approximately 40 million. Under food insecurity, the Ag Committee passed in a 15% increase to SNAP benefits, and that will last through 9/30. Under housing, it'd be $19 billion for emergency rental and utility assistance, $5 billion for housing choice vouchers to help people at risk of homelessness, $100 million for neighborhood works, and $10 billion to states and territories for ongoing needs of homeowners, which include things like property insurance, utilities, taxes, other housing costs, mortgage payments, things of the like. One point I do want to make more generally is that we are still very early in the reconciliation process. These numbers are subject to change. There are rules in the Senate that called the bird rule and the quote unquote bird bath, where under reconciliation you have to follow very strict guidelines on what does and does not affect the federal deficit. So you have to, things might get changed, long story short, and throughout the process. But as of now, we are moving quickly to get this package out the door. I believe the Senate will turn it around relatively quickly. They'll probably send it back to us with some slight changes, and then we will pass it and get it signed into law. That's generally where things stand. I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any, but stating the fact that I might have to go back and get answers for you. I might not have them off the top of my head. But otherwise, that should cover it for the federal update. If there's anything else I can answer, please let me know.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And also, if anyone does have any questions along the way here, please enter them into the chat box and we'll pose them to the appropriate individual. I wanted to ask Deb Stein, who not only watches what's going on in the various states, but at our Capitol in Washington, from your perspective, how things look and what you see this package perhaps looking like when it gets to the Senate.
Sure. I don't actually think it's going to change before it gets to the Senate. The question is what's going to happen there. So let me say, first of all, that I think it's very, very clear that some version of this package is going to pass. Even in the Senate, it's going to pass on a party line vote. And we know that because that was the vote that passed the budget resolution that set up this whole reconciliation fast track budget process. What we know is happening in the Senate is that they're already starting the process that Vic referred to of reviewing the bill to make sure it complies with the Senate bird rule, going through the bird bath. And I will talk in a moment about the provisions that we think are most likely to be changed under that rule. Once the House passes the bill, we expect it to go to get modified to accommodate the parliamentarians' rulings on what fit the Byrd rule and what don't, and then go to the Senate floor where there could be amendments. And as Vic said, that means that the bill they pass won't be identical to the House, so it'll have to then go back to the House to pass so that they've passed the same final version. There's a small chance, I think, that they might try and work together to work out differences before they both pass it again, but I think it's most likely to just go back to the House. The goal is to pass it before March 14th, which is when the current unemployment insurance benefits expire. And anything can happen, of course, but so far they are on schedule for that. The second thing that, well, a couple of other key points about it. While we do expect the bill to pass, and to pass at the full $1.9 billion mark that is authorized under the budget instructions, we expect it to pass only with Democratic support. But it doesn't need and probably will not get any Republicans, although it's always possible. I say that because you're going to hear a lot of concerns about some of the provisions in the bill from Republicans, and that's not likely to affect the outcome of the bill. There are some concerns about the shape of the bill from a few Democrats who are clearly willing to vote for it, but not necessarily with every provision that's in there. So it's important to understand when people comment on the bill that if they're Democrats, that is more likely to change the bill. The other thing I really want everybody on this call to know is that when this bill passes, it is going to reduce child poverty by half in this country for the year 2021. That won't stay because the provisions in question are temporary provisions, but when you put together the change in the child tax credit, the change in the nutrition provisions, the change in the unemployment benefits, and the one-time stimulus payment, it's literally going to cut child poverty in half for a year. That's a huge change, and we need to recognize it. There's an analysis from the Columbia University Center on Poverty and Social Policy that documents that, and that's true even if the minimum wage provision is not included. What that means in Illinois is that nearly 1 million Illinois children who don't currently get the full child tax credit will benefit from it, and 1/3 of 1 million Illinois children will either be lifted above the poverty line or get closer to it. So that's a really big deal, and we do expect later in the year to have an effort to then extend the expansion of the child tax credit into future years. I also want to say that while there are provisions that may change, and I'll talk about them in a moment, the versions that will support the Illinois state and local budgets are probably not changing. They are not controversial under the Byrd rule. There are a lot of Republicans who think that they are too high, but I haven't heard any concerns about the state and local government funding provisions from Senate Democrats. So what might change? Well, there's been a lot of attention to the minimum wage, which could be stripped out of it if the parliamentarian decides it fails the Byrd rule. Or 2 Democratic senators have said that they are not happy about having the minimum wage provision in the bill. One might be willing to pass it at a lower level at $11 an hour or $10 an hour instead of 15, and that's Senator Manchin. Senator Sinema from Arizona, it's unclear if she's willing to vote for any bill that includes the minimum wage. Democrats are also looking at alternatives that might make it easier to pass, something like a tax to help small businesses pay their staff, something like that. 2 other provisions that I've also heard might be problematic under the Byrd rule. One, for reasons I'm not entirely clear about, is the paid sick leave provision. The other one is that while the child tax credit amendment and expansion itself should be fine under the Byrd rule, and there doesn't seem to be any controversy about including it, they are trying to pay it out monthly rather than in one lump sum, and that monthly payment process may not pass the Byrd rule because it doesn't actually affect the federal budget. Once it gets past the parliamentarian in that Byrd rule, we may also see floor amendments, and the ones that I think are of most concern, at least to child advocates, and the one that I think is most likely to pass is changing the stimulus payment so to make it less accessible to children and immigrant families. The version that passed the House would allow all citizen children, all kids with Social Security numbers, to benefit from that stimulus payment, even if the adults in their household do not have authority to work in this country. And we might see it cut back, either so that at least one adult has to have authority to work in this country, or conceivably even that there could be no undocumented people in the household. So we'll be watching that pretty closely. Aside from that, the only other thing I want to make sure you know is that this is the first reconciliation bill of the year. It's actually for fiscal year 2021, and they can and probably will do a separate reconciliation bill for fiscal year 2022 that will include provisions that are more about recovery and rebuilding the country. This is really the rescue plan to get us out of the immediate pandemic crisis. Mitch?
Thank you.
I'm
I
happy to
appreciate
take
that.
questions in the chat or at the end of the webinar.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to the state comptroller now. Recognizing that what you said could completely change the picture in a month, I'm curious, Comptroller Mendoza, your thoughts on the proposed budget, and given the framework of state finances, what your thoughts are as to where it will lead us for the next fiscal year and beyond.
Sure. Well, thank you, Tasha and Mitch. It's nice to actually see also Representatives Lilly and Demmer. Hi. Lots of familiar faces, but I want to thank you all so much for inviting me to talk to you today. I appreciate everything that you do for the children of Illinois, and I hope you know that my entire office appreciates what you do, and we frankly want to just make it easier for you folks to be able to operate. Now, obviously, more than ever in this vicious pandemic, we need organizations like yours, Voices for Illinois Children, speaking up. So, look, well, I'm happy to give you an update on the Comptroller's Office and some other views of mine on state finances. I would also really like to hear about the challenges that you're facing. We've heard a couple updates this morning, but I, as the Comptroller, would like to hear some of the challenges that you as an organization are facing, especially right now during these very challenging times given the pandemic and a new budget that's out. But I first want to tell you that since being sworn in as Comptroller back in December of 2016, I have really gone out of my way. I've tried so hard to prioritize payments for social services. I truly believe that it is so essential that social service advocates, and I already mentioned you, but there's so many other advocates out there in the social service sector, that you would be able to depend on state support, even during the most difficult times facing the state. If you have any issues, of course, please feel free to reach out to my office. We're always here to help. And I hope that many of you have had the opportunity to meet with, or at least get to know, maybe virtually, Patty Vasquez-Bonin. She's on the call, so Patty, please give everybody a wave. Patty just joined my office as our outreach coordinator, specifically for social service agencies last year, and she's great. So if you haven't met her yet, make sure you touch base. And of all the services that the state of Illinois funds, the operations you work with are, to me, the most important. Providing services for Illinois' vulnerable, for our children. That's what we really need to focus more of our attention and our resources on. And so feel free to keep telling us how we as a Comptroller's Office can do even better than we're trying to do today. Now, I like to think, how do we get here? I'd say we've come a long way from the budget impasse of a few years ago, which is what I walked into when I was sworn in December of 2016. When I took office at that time, I found out that my predecessor was actually taking months and months to pay social service agencies, putting IT consultants on speed pay. It seemed so wrong to me. And so I reversed that policy on day one. And things were actually looking up. You know, a year ago, we were looking better financially. The markets were saying as much. And we weren't quite out of the woods yet. I kept saying that, but we could finally see some light between the trees. Then, of course, COVID happened, right? And we all know what that's been like. It's made it much harder for all of you to do your jobs. It's closed the state's restaurants, bars, hotels, and that, of course, meant the state had less money coming in to pay its bills. So we've put all recipients of state money on notice that we may have to go back to delaying payments like we did in the impasse days. So far, we haven't had to, thank God. But Mitch, I would say that while in your presentation, you talked about how things have been looking so much better in the economy, let me just put that into context. we were expecting a $5 billion loss of revenue because of COVID, and we have essentially experienced a $3 billion loss. So yeah, the revenue estimate, or the lack of revenue estimate, was not as horrific as we thought, but it was still pretty horrific. A $3 billion less revenue hole coming in is not anything to be excited about. Now, as a matter of fact, because of that huge hole, I would call it a COVID crater, we did take advantage, which I think was the right thing to do for sure, of an opportunity to borrow $2 billion just recently from the Federal Reserve. And I was able to target those $2 billion to paying off critical medical bills that the state had in the middle of a global pandemic. So this was a good use of that $2 billion, because I was able to target bills that we also received federal matches on. So that $2 billion essentially turned into closer to $3.4 billion. And that's how we as an office in the controller's office have tried to really leverage every dollar that we can and stretch it to its greatest extent in the benefit of taxpayers. Across the state, every hospital, hospice center, nursing home, they all benefited from this infusion that allowed us to pay these important bills. And as of this morning, our backlog of unpaid bills is actually down a little bit from what you mentioned. It is down to about 4.8 billion. And yes, we still have that 4.3 billion that we are working to pay off. So let me just frame this for you here. When Governor Pritzker asked me as a controller to sign off on borrowing up to $5 billion from the Federal Reserve, I said no. I told him only $2 billion was the most that I would be willing or comfortable signing off on, because any more than that, I'd have trouble making payments on. And we're not going to put us into a worse fiscal condition just because the legislature was nice enough to say we had the authority to borrow $5 billion. Certainly doesn't mean that we should borrow $5 billion. And that's where, I have to just speak truth to power here and say we don't have the capacity to take that on. It would hurt our credit rating. We wouldn't be able to pay it back, et cetera, et cetera. But $2 billion is a responsible approach to take. And the governor, thankfully, was very understanding of that, approved the understanding that we had that my support was essentially contingent on an understanding that any new federal stimulus money would be earmarked first and foremost to paying off that borrowing. The governor agreed with that, and it is the responsible approach to take. Keep in mind that because I was able to borrow that $2 billion, is that I was able to pay so many social service bills and healthcare bills. And if you think about the fact, if we don't prioritize that spending, that would actually hurt the very people that we're trying to help in this next coming budget. So regarding the budget, I do believe, from my perspective, that Governor Pritzker presented a cautious but morally responsible plan that recognizes the predicament that Illinois finds itself in at this time, without seeking to balance the budget on the backs of working families. I think it was a very difficult task to come in and try to balance a budget in the middle of a pandemic. And again, remember, it's a starting point. It's not the end all be all. But I am certainly pleased that he's prioritizing healthcare and human and social services, because they are vital to helping people survive the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And let's remember that many people in Illinois, for the very first time in their lives, are having to seek government assistance. This is a new thing for many people here in Illinois. The I think difficult part for me as a controller is to think that, when a new person has to come on to government assistance because they lost their job, that means that not only is less revenue coming into our state in taxes, but more revenue is leaving because we're trying to hold these people up and make sure that they don't fall through the safety net. So it's like a double whammy on our finances. But back to the budget, the total investment of nearly $900 million for DHS in the fiscal year 2022 budget, led by $591 million from the federal government, combined with $283 million from the state's general funds. That's one of the few bright spots in what is mostly, I would suggest, a very tight spending plan. The last thing we need to do right now is to shred our social safety net. Again, just to save some money. It doesn't save us any money. It's fiscally irresponsible and it's morally irresponsible. We must recognize and meet the increased demand for human services. We need to support communities hardest hit by the pandemic. I would say in particular the Black and Brown and rural communities in Illinois. This pandemic magnifies the disproportionate impact that long-term systemic racism has had on some communities and groups. And we see that in the disproportionate numbers of minorities who have either contracted or have died as a result of this pandemic. So, I mean, that if it wasn't clear before, I think it's very clear today. Now, as a social service provider, you know how important it is for state government to maintain a balanced budget so that future budgets can continue to provide predictable and stable state support for your programs. And I hope you all agree by now that paying our debt when we are able to is a key element toward that financial stability of Illinois' finances. It's a balanced approach to a balanced budget that we are kind of all analyzing right now. And I believe the governor is demonstrating responsibility by putting forth significant spending cuts. It's a blueprint, as I started off with saying, for starting the budget negotiations with the legislature. And there are going to be some tough decisions on healthcare, education, human social services that currently await in the balance before the new fiscal year, all again at a time when people are struggling more than ever. So I do believe that we need to do everything in our power to protect the services of our most vulnerable citizens. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but let me just end that point with this thought that while I think that the budget that the governor put forth is a balanced approach to a balanced budget, the fact of the matter is that we'll never have a truly balanced budget until we pay down the bill backlog and address our short-term debt. We're doing the very best we can to do that. Certainly having more revenues would have been helpful, but that's not the case. And it's another reason why we're so clearly, like everyone already who has spoke before me, we have such a watchful eye on what's happening in Washington with, I would say, hopeful and watchful eyes. And we did hear from Deb Stein and from Vic from the Congressman's office, Congressman Schneider's office. And we had spoken with Congressman Krishnamurthy, who had offered similar numbers, right? But that stimulus, which they're assuming could be in that 7.5 billion area for Illinois, it would certainly be nice, but we can't count on it until it happens. And we certainly can't count on that happening again every year. I mean, if we are lucky enough to see that type of revenue this year, it will only be a one-time vaccine for our finances. You should think of it that way. It's not like it's Christmas morning and we have a bunch of gifts under the table, or it's not like mom and dad sent us a check and we can just go spend it. Again, that money essentially is spoken for. We have a structural deficit that's built into our budget that everyone on this call needs to worry about, right? Because it impacts what all of us can do for years to come. I mean, I believe that one of the best ways of tackling that would have been to pass the fair tax, but unfortunately it was defeated, which obviously hurts our ability to close our structural deficit. So again, from my perspective as controller, without that structural deficit being solved or having some way to close that massive structural deficit, it just makes my job of having to triage the state's finances with significant backlog that much harder. But frankly, it's what I'm used to. I'd say for me, unfortunately, it's another day here in Illinois that since I've taken office, I've only known how to manage crises. But if there's a silver lining in this, is that we've gotten pretty good at it. It's certainly in my office, and I feel that I've got a sound handle on how to make sure that we're prioritizing the right people, certainly during times of need. So none of us, though, like to hear this fact, but we really do need to make cuts in the state budget. Obviously, until we find a long-term revenue fix that will allow us to properly fund education and things that we care about, like social services and everything else that the state needs to be doing. But we all know that there is no way. I think anyone responsible would tell you that there is no way to simply cut our way out of Illinois' fiscal problems. We do need cuts, but it's not the end-all solution to it. We do need some new revenues that would be necessary to solve this year's deficit and future shortfalls going forward. The federal money, that will not solve our shortfalls going forward. It will help us this year, and we will, like I said, put most of that towards paying back our bills, which is a responsible thing to do and critically necessary for me to be able to have additional lines of credit available should we need them to get through these budget cycles. But that money has to be paid back. Most of it is spoken for. If there is some left over, then we could have the debate as to whether that should go towards education or other investments that could create job growth, et cetera, et cetera. But listen, I could talk for hours, but I think that you just don't want to hear from me. And I'd certainly like to hear from the legislators, both Representative Lilly and Representative Demmer, and then get to your questions.
Thank you. Well, Representative Lilly, how does this budget look to you and your colleagues, and what do you see as the prospects for it going forward? Representative Lilly, I think you're on mute. There you go.
Okay, thank you, Miss. Thank you, Tasha. Thank you, for Illinois Children and all of your partners. It is important that we have these type of discussions. One is information and two is perspectives. I will say, first of all, happy Black History Month. And so my background, it has everything to do with, Black history. However, I do not know how to remove it. So you probably will see it in March because I'm like, how do I get this removed? But at any rate, I'm excited to be celebrating Black History Month. Two, this is my first term as the chair of APPROAP Human Services. So I'm excited about the learnings that I'm going to experience as we put forth the incoming budget. It is really important that we work as a team to figure this out. As we focused on balancing the budget, the proposal by the governor was the best look that he could bring to balance the budget. We, as General Assembly, we're looking to balance the budget as well. And when you're looking to balance the budget when we're receiving less, that really means there's going to be changes. That's given. There's going to be changes in many of the line items that is going to be in our budget. Mitch did a good job of really outlining all of the budget areas and some of the changes that the governor proposed. I just want to highlight that the overall budget, again, is $42.7 billion for the full appropriation for human services, which is $472 million less than FY21. And the dollars that we appropriate within the human services is $14.9 billion in GRF. So those are the dollars that I will be responsible for, along with all of the committee members and along with the General Assembly, earmarking where those dollars will go for the incoming budget. That is $313 million less, nevertheless. And most of that reduction you'll find in human services, health and family services. So it is really going to be a challenge because health and wellness is really the key to what's going on in our society today due to the pandemic. So it's going to be some challenges there. However, some of the other line items that have received increased through the proposed budget is Department of Aging, Department of Children and Family Services, Department of Human Services, ICDD, and CDDS. So those were most of the increases. You'll see a little increase in those areas in the proposed budget. However, we have the task before us with folks like yourselves to figure out how we balance the budget with less. So we are working very diligently, and we thank Comptroller Mendoza for just working with us as we go through this, because she has the important task and the challenge of paying our bills. So and she's been very, very supportive of how we get it done. And as she mentioned, her tenure has been how to balance a budget with less. That's how I'm going to put it, Susanna. And unfortunately, we have another year of that in front of us. However, when we're talking to the federal government and what's going on at the federal government with the stimulus, I like to have more conversations with them in reference to how do we fund the necessary needs that has been impacted by the pandemic, and how we get them to see how we work together as a federal government and the state to get that done. I'm excited that we have President Biden and Vice President Harris to really understand the vision of we are our people, we are our brother's keeper is how I like to present that, particularly during these challenging times in our country. And so that allows us to get a little bit more done in this next coming year. So I'm going to stop there. with my comments, and I open to any questions. Again, I have short comments again because this is my first term as the chair of Appropriate Human Service, so I have some things to learn, and I learn by listening. So, Mitch, thank you for having me.
And I do want to come back and ask you about the K through 12 budget, but before I do that, I wanted to get Representative Demmer's take on the budget, and also what you see as the prospects for the proposals on the tax expenditures that the governor outlined, and if they do not all materialize, what you see happening then.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mitch, and I appreciate being able to speak with you all today. This is a good group. We've had a lot of productive conversations through the years. And I also appreciate the input and the information that both Comptroller Mendoza and Representative Lilly have shared today, as well as our Washington insiders who told us a little bit about what to expect from the stimulus out there. You know, I think there's just, without rehashing some of these points, I think there's a few important things to think about as we consider the state budget going forward. One of the first things is a decision from the state about how to use and how to maximize this enhanced FMAP that we're currently under. This is an improvement in the state's matching rate for the Medicaid program, a really significant program within the state budget today. In the early days of the pandemic, I think we used the enhanced FMAP to provide additional funding to healthcare providers around the state. And since then, we've used it as a way to provide some GRF budgetary relief. Both of those are necessary and both of those are legitimate causes right now. And it's worthwhile, I think, for us as a legislature to have continued discussion about where to allocate those additional dollars that have come from the federal government to the state in terms of both providing additional support to providers as well as some overall budgetary relief. It's also worth keeping an eye on that the strings that might be attached to the FMAP increase going forward in future federal stimulus, federal COVID relief bills, about whether there are restrictions on whether a state can use those enhanced FMAP funds to supplant or to supplement additional or current funding for healthcare services. I've seen some proposals that have said that the extension of that FMAP would be required to supplement current funding and not to supplant it. And that limits obviously the options that might be available to the state. I would compliment Comptroller Mendoza for really prioritizing the payment of Medicaid bills, especially during this time where we have an enhanced match rate. That I think has provided us the opportunity to pay down bills much more aggressively than what it would otherwise have been available. And so that's I think a great use of Illinois maximizing the federal match that we're able to draw down during an obviously challenging time for all of us. The other point that I'd make is, Mitch referenced in the budget proposal, the governor has identified certain items that he calls corporate loopholes. First, it's a little bit of a misnomer to call those corporate loopholes. I mean, they include certain things such as scholarship program for low-income families. It's a bit of a stretch to call that a corporate loophole. We also include some items there that were part of a bipartisan negotiation during the passage of the Capitol bill that Democrats and Republicans together in the legislature approved, and Governor Pritzker himself signed into law, to do things like remove this completely antiquated and burdensome franchise tax in which almost 300,000 Illinois small businesses had to comply with this separate filing, not to the Department of Revenue, but to the Secretary of State's office, only to find out that they owe the bare minimum of the franchise tax, which is $25. I mean, we talk about the things that we do in Illinois that put pressure on small businesses. A franchise tax is first among those. So there are certainly some items in there that I think make Illinois less competitive when it comes to looking at attracting new jobs and new investments relative to other states. And that's going to be an incredibly important thing for us going forward. So as the entire United States starts to emerge from the pandemic, and we see this influx of capital that's going to come back into making decisions about where to invest in new facilities, new employment, Illinois must reverse the tide that we're currently seeing of people, of families who are choosing to leave the state, of businesses who are choosing other states to invest. If we want to talk about a long-term and sustainable revenue picture, it revolves around Illinois' ability to continue to grow and to thrive and to be competitive with states all across the United States. This is a perfect opportunity for Illinois to say, what things could we do today that would make us a more attractive place for growth to happen, for revenue growth, for job growth, for economic growth to happen in the years ahead. I look forward to Representative Lilly is taking over as chairperson of the Appropriation Human Services Committee. I look forward to working together with her. We've had some great opportunity to work together on the Medicaid work group over the last several years. And obviously the Appropriations Human Services Committee is a central place for a lot of these discussions to happen. And so I really look for this to be an opportunity for us to make some longer term questions about where can we make investments in human services today that are really going to save us money in the long run, and more importantly, have a positive impact on the quality of life and some of the social determinants of health that we see in all the communities that we serve. And so, really, I think in a way, unlike maybe some other areas of state government where it's a little bit more day-to-day operational spending, the investment choices that we're making in human services have an ability to affect the trajectory of a person's life. And so it's an incredibly important place for us to focus our efforts. But we also have to keep in mind, the other pressures that we have around us, the economic performance pressures that we have, the fact that, a budget was offered by Governor Pritzker this year that essentially held flat most areas of state spending, but which had to account for a $730 million increase in our pension contribution. We have to be serious about dealing with and looking for ways to mitigate some of the really significant upward pressures that we have, even with small amount of pension reform, even with some minor changes to the state's pension system. We could see that $730 million start to come down, and every dollar that we could free up from some of those obligations would be an important and valued dollar we can invest in things like education or human services. So I look forward to continuing the conversation and be happy, of course, to, along with my fellow panelists, answer any questions that might come up.
Thank you. Representative Lilly, I just wanted to get your perspective and what you think the caucus's point of view is on not including that additional $350 million for the evidence-based school funding formula.
Well, let me just start with my normal statement when it comes to education. We here in the state of Illinois need to fund education as our #1 priority. When we begin to negotiate education, which that's what it looks like and sounds like when we go into these negotiations, it impacts the health and wellness of our entire society. Through our subject matter here, we learned that what correlates with poor health is their education or lack of education. And so when you do not implement a policy that we all pretty much voted for to make sure that our future, which is our children, maintain the education that allows them quality of life and access to opportunity, it starts with education. So not funding it as the priority, that is a concern for many of our communities, and particularly those that are hardest hit and those that lack infrastructure. When you start cutting and not having those dollars available, those who already have less will receive less than what they need in order to just really formulate the opportunities and the brainchild of our children through our education system. So I'm very concerned, but again, we are just entering in these discussions, but I always present a resolution to fund education as our #1 priority, so we won't have to keep coming back to this conversation. We can negotiate everything else if we so desire, but the education is key to everyone's quality of life. So that's my response to that.
Thank you. And I wanted to ask both you and Representative Demmer, while there is the prospect of additional funding for rent and housing assistance from Washington, when the moratorium on evictions expires on the state level and for the provision that the president has on the federal level, do you think the state needs to take further steps, whether it is regarding rental and mortgage assistance or the stock of affordable housing in the state?
Yeah, I would say that I think it's a really important place for the state to prioritize some investment towards increasing the stock of affordable housing. I'm currently working with Representative Ramirez on a bill to increase the affordable housing tax credit. I think there are a number of things we can do to improve the opportunities that folks have to find affordable housing throughout the state of Illinois. Also, some of the discussions that have happened in the city of Chicago around the auxiliary dwelling units and some of the opportunities that might provide. Those are good steps forward that we should take that can both help support, individuals, you want to call them landlords, who are paying for a certain property right now and might want to find an alternate source of income. It can really be a support to that. But it also gives people a better opportunity to have some mobility in their housing and to find a place that really suits them and their families. So I think those are important things to consider. It's also, I think, as we talk about landlord or renter support, using some of these additional federal dollars, we also have to talk about supports that could come to many of the small businesses across the state who have seen closures, seen significant reductions in their revenues. We have a balance to strike, I think, as state policymakers between identifying and supporting some of the problems in the state budget, but also we have to recognize the significant strain that is put on individuals' budgets and on budgets of small businesses. So I think that is going to be a delicate balance to strike with whatever additional revenue we might eventually see from Washington.
Thank you. Well, I know we're at our 1 hour limit, so, and there's more to talk about, but before turning it back over to Tasha, if any of our elected officials have any closing comments that they want to make, please feel free to do so.
I'm just going to interject that, as you all have seen and heard, that the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus passed 4 pillars that improves the quality of life of all Illinoisans, focusing in on the poor, the Black and brown communities. And we have a challenge in front of us for the implementation of all of that policy that have been in front of us for decades. We just had the opportunity through the efforts of our colleagues to get it passed this time. And what we want to do is to make sure that we are working collectively to address all the issues such as housing that you mentioned. If you do not have adequate housing, it's going to affect your health care, and which will affect your quality of life, which affects the community in a public health situation. And then we have a pandemic. And then over 500,000 people have not survived a pandemic here in the US. So the federal government has to shift its mindset that this America is about the people. And I want to continue to work with both sides of the aisles, all levels of government, to understand the quality of life is about the people. So I'll end with that, and I thank you for having me.
Thank you. Comptroller Mendoza, anything you would like to add as a closing comment?
Well, I always, since you're asking me, and if I get to make a request, and we still have Congressman Schneider's representative here, I would say, please, like whatever money you send us, do it with the least amount of strings attached as possible. Because in my line of work, I feel like I've done an amazing job of maximizing every dollar that you send me. But if I can only spend it on certain things that we may not even need to be spending it on that, it's like a wasted opportunity. So I'm going to just beat that horse till it's, that we need more dollars, but you need to trust that the states, and I know it's hard to say trust the state and how we spend it, right? But I think that my track record speaks for itself on how we're prioritizing every single dollar, certainly in the middle of the pandemic. And I'd like to turn whatever money they send me, multiply that by targeting it as much as possible to federal matches and areas where we can stretch that dollar as much as humanly possible. So That's what I would say there. And then also, again, Representative Lilly and Representative Demmer, as much as I wish we could spend money on everything that we want, remember, most of that is spoken for, which is why if I have the ability to leverage it in a way where we can make $1 turned into $1.56, then we have potentially some additional dollars left at the end of the day that we could look towards putting towards things like the funding formula with education, which I very much believe is a necessity, and other economic growth opportunities for our state. Because I think we all of us, if we're on this call today, I think we are on the same page on a lot of issues, and everything is interconnected, right? If you take person's housing away, of course, being homeless is going to clearly lead you to an unhealthy lifestyle, right? My brother, Joaquin, who's a Chicago police officer today, he is actually living in my home. I've become, besides managing the fiscal crisis, his primary caregiver. And there's so many people like me. COVID hit him as a police officer. He was 41 days in the hospital, 3 weeks in a inpatient rehab, and is now living with me. He uses a walker, needs dialysis 3 days a week for the rest of his life, suffered many strokes while he was in the hospital because of COVID. And he was a young guy. He was hospitalized 2 days after his birthday. And this is very real. And so, like, we're just beginning to feel the consequences of what this pandemic is. We're just trying to stay alive and make it to a point where everybody can get vaccinated, but there's going to be years worth of aftermath of increased healthcare costs, because I'll use him as an example. Prior to this, he didn't have very many healthcare costs. Now I got his hospital bill the other day and it was almost $400,000. So this is the reality that many people in Illinois and across the country are going to be dealing with. And as state governments, we have to be cognizant of this. This is not a budget issue that's going to go away in a year or 2 or 10. We're going to be dealing with the aftermath of this pandemic in many different ways, whether it's through housing or it's healthcare, or because we're in such bad fiscal straits, not being able to invest in education the way we'd like to is going to have negative consequences. So again, not an easy job, but I trust that we have good representatives who are up to standing up to the challenge, and I'm here to help in any way that I can. So thank you. God bless you all who are on the call today. I know you care about people and helping them, and we're here to be an ally in that effort. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank everyone who participated for your comments. Tasha, the floor is yours.
Well, this has been a wonderful discussion. I feel like we need a part 2. I think we're going to plan for part 2 to talk about updates after we get that stimulus package that we are awaiting by mid-March. Thank you so much, Comptroller Mendoza, Representative Demmer, Representative Lilly, and Deb Stein for your comments, your thoughts, your insight. This has been absolutely wonderful. We appreciate your leadership. I encourage you just to keep fighting for our people. You're doing a wonderful job. I commend Comptroller Mendoza for prioritizing the debt and making sure that we get that. We just keep chipping away. And Representative Demmer and Representative Lilly, your work in health and human services has been very impactful. So thank you so much for all of your hard work. And Deb, keep being our ears and eyes in Washington, D.C. We really depend on you for that insight. But I want to thank all of you for joining. This website will be published on our website as well as United Voices for Children. And I also want to thank them for being our partner and host today for this fantastic webinar. So all of you, please be safe and be well. And we will look for part 2.